Hello, everyone. I'm Jamie Kelly, Chief Philanthropy Officer here at the National Park Foundation. I'd like to welcome everyone to our Inside the Parks virtual program. We have a record number of guests joining us, and like you, I've been looking forward to today's conversation with Ken Burns. At the heart of today's program are our Champion Society members and other donors whose support for our national parks safeguards our natural, cultural, and historical heritage. This year, more than 250,000 people like you have provided critical, unrestricted support for our national parks. Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce everyone on screen today, starting with our featured speaker, Ken Burns. For a generation and more, Ken has brought the best stories of American history and experience into our living rooms. Through extraordinary documentaries, Ken captures and animates the essence of America's past in ways that resonate with each of us, sharing the individual voices of people from every era. His work has significant acclaim, garnering 17 Emmys, 2 Grammys, and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Television Academy. Ken's programs educate and inspire us to see our shared American history in a new light. From the first baseball pitch to the sweeping landscapes of our national parks, Ken is a master storyteller. Ken, on behalf of the National Park Foundation, we are delighted to have you here. Welcome.
It's so great to be with you. Thank you, Jamie.
And now I'll turn it over to Will Shafroth, President and CEO of the National Park Foundation, who will guide today's discussion.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Thank you everybody for being here. Listen, we all share a lifelong passion for our national parks. And like everybody joining us here today virtually, we're inspired by the generosity of those who came before us in setting such a high bar and supporting ways to preserve our nation's natural and cultural heritage. So I just want to thank all of you that are joining us today for your love and commitment to our national parks. You're following in the footsteps of many who have come before you and helping us blaze new trails for the future of our national parks. And welcome, Ken. I've been looking forward to our conversation for quite a while. How you doing?
I'm doing great, my friend. Great to see you.
Good to see you again. Ken, let's start out with what you and your team are currently working on. Really exciting. I understand that you have a soon-to-be released special on the works about Leonardo da Vinci. Can you give our audience a preview and frankly, what drew you to Leonardo da Vinci?
Well, it's our first non-American topic, so it's super, super exciting. But, this is a guy who has a total reverence for nature. That's capital N. That's his great teacher. And so one of the things that you understand, whether you're approaching Leonardo because of his painting, his artwork, his anatomy, his biology, his botany, his science, all of the things that he was, begins at this reverence for nature. So we're thrilled to be doing it. It's coming out, it's done. So we're now in the promotional evangelical phase. It'll be out on PBS on November 18th and 19th. It's a 2-part, 4-hour film. And I just promise you that you will never make a joke about Mona Lisa's smile again, because you'll know what it means. And part of what's so spectacular about that painting, as in many, is the background, which shows this extraordinary understanding of our natural world. How could you not be drawn to somebody who's using 75% of his brain when, as I'm told, we're using only 10?
Yeah, that's so great. Well, we look forward to it, November 18th and 19th. Let's make sure we let our audience know and a reminder, Jamie, about this great event. Ken, we'd also like to know a bit more about how you pick a subject to explore. I mean, obviously you could choose hundreds or thousands of different ideas, but you land on, just relatively few in these great specials you've created. For example, when we first met 15 years ago, you were working on the PBS National Park Series, America's Best Idea, and that program remains a favorite. I mean, I get people calling me all the time saying, I just saw that thing again on PBS. It's awesome. And so why did you pick national parks as a topic? And how did you approach selecting, identifying which parks to focus on and which stories to tell?
Well, that's a wonderful question. It's one of the most satisfying projects I've ever worked on. The glib answer to how we choose them is that they choose us. You know, if I were given 1,000 years to live, which I won't, I would not run out of topics in American history, Leonardo notwithstanding. This is something my producing partner and writer Dayton Duncan and I had been talking about for a long time. We'd worked on a history of the West. We'd worked on a history of Lewis and Clark. We'd done a humorous look at the first cross-country automobile trip, but all of it was sort of centered around where we were filming were our national parks. And so we didn't want to do a travelogue. We didn't want to do a what recommendation of what inn to stay at. We wanted to tell the history of how they came about. And as you know, as well as anyone, that each park has its own unique story. It has its own mega history, from native peoples to even the geological conditions that formed him. My goodness, the Colorado River at the Grand Canyon reveals Precambrian Vishnu schist that is 1.7 billion years old, which is nearly half the age of our planet. So there's a great story to be told. And then there's always a person or a group of people who decided to somehow reverse the tide of what was the relentlessness of manifest destiny, which is you see a forest, you cut it down. You see a river, you dam it. You see a canyon, you mine it for whatever can be extracted, and realized that we were going to be rich anyway. We'd be richer if we could set aside some of this. We felt that the national parks were the Declaration of Independence applied to the landscape. And so wild horses couldn't keep us from a project which up until that point took the longest to make, nearly 10 years from the moment we said go to the moment of broadcast. And it allowed us to go many, many places. And you realize you can't tell with all of the different units and all of the national parks, you couldn't do them all, but you could represent them visually, and you could also take signal and emblematic places and go deep dive in those stories. You don't want to be an encyclopedia or a dictionary. You want to be a storyteller. So we realized that our audience, maybe they're unhappy that we forgot a favorite place of theirs, but we could extrapolate for a broad national audience, which was beginning, attendance was beginning to decline through the aughts. And I'm really happy to say that I was called by Secretary Salazar, who was then, once the series was out, the year after the series came out in September of 2009, that attendance had suddenly spiked by 12 to 15 million. And he said, "I'm blaming it all on you."
Right.
Happy to say, okay, I'm guilty.
Guilty as charged.
Guilty as charged, sir.
Well, listen, I also think it's wonderful to be able to do a project like that. You got to do with such a good friend, Dayton Duncan. I know that you shared that you're doing the project on Da Vinci with your daughter. I mean, what's that like to be able to work with people that you're so close to?
It's, this is a little gal, as the Italian said, mia primogenita, my oldest daughter, who was born while I was making films. And I can see her in a diaper now, crawling underneath the editing machine. Now, she will never speak to me again because I just brought that up. But she's had it in her blood. And we thought she was going to be a lawyer after she went to college, but she wanted to do a film on the Central Park 5, the story of the 5 young boys that were wrongfully imprisoned and served out their full term with coerced confessions. And so she wrote a book. And as I was reading as an early editor, I realized this was a film, and her husband, David McMahon, a great filmmaker that I've worked with, we just continued it. And so that led to Jackie Robinson. It led to Muhammad Ali, and now Leonardo da Vinci. We have 3 projects lined up in front of us that will take us, God and funding willing, through the end of the 20s. All very exciting. And it's just a wonderful thing to be able to work with your daughter, particularly when she turns out to be smarter than you.
That's good. Well, all mine are smarter than me, so I got that. Listen, let's get back to the parks and some of the voices, including John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt, who are central characters in your park series. The lens that they each used to view the roles of our public lands was shaped by our nation's founding and the reshaping of our culture during the 19th century. You kind of touched on that already. I'm curious to know what you imagine those two would think of the 431 national park sites today and how the Park Service has evolved since then.
I think they'd be so proud of it. And let's remember, they are two super, super important voices that are critical to the very, very beginning. John Muir in Yosemite, which is not the first formal national park, that's Yellowstone, but it is the first time the federal government set aside any land, gave it to some supervisors in California who didn't do the best possible job and ended up coming into the fold a little bit later. But so in some ways, Yosemite is the first park. John Muir is its great champion, and that's important. And then you reach this point where after Frederick Jackson Turner issues his famous essay about the end of the frontier in 1893, there's this real self-reflective America that say, have we just ruined itself? Have we run out of frontier? What are we going to do? And what it took was this next octave of energy, which is Theodore Roosevelt to set aside, to declare the national monuments. He's been given that great gift from Congress. To create national monuments, and uses it also for the Grand Canyon, 880,000, when the first one, Devil's Tower, is under 5,000 acres. So you've got this, robust person who's come to it late. I mean, he didn't really have it. It took George Bird Grinnell and other people to sort of tell him a little bit about it. But once he got started, he was great. What's interesting, and I think what they both take notice of, is that it's not just these gorgeous places of great national scenery, waterfalls and mountains and canyons and things like that, but it also has included places of species diversification, like the Everglades. There's places of historical interest, which his fifth cousin, TR's fifth cousin, FDR, did. He began to amalgamate all these specific historic sites were in a hodgepodge of federal and other sorts of control, and coalesce them into it. So now what we mean by a national park site is really complicated and continuing to evolve, just like that democratic energy that I tell you. When Jefferson wrote all men are created equal, he meant all white men of property free of debt. We don't mean that now. And so I love the idea that the national park idea has grown with us, and there's so many important individuals, unsung and relatively well known, like Stephen Mather, the first head of the Park Service, who are extraordinary, complicated champions of the park idea or of a specific park, and made it happen. And if you go to Acadia, or if you go to the Everglades, if you go to Glacier, if you go to here or there, you can ask a question, and with the very little digging, you can find out a human story behind this extraordinary natural wonder.
Yeah. I want to go back to your mention of Yosemite, because I imagine most people don't appreciate that happened during the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln, to have the foresight in the moment of complete national chaos to see the necessity and the possibility that setting aside that land would do. I mean,
It's extraordinary. I mean, you think what happens during the Civil War with the Homestead Act and the land grant college stuff, but the national parks, he signs that into law when there are 2,000 casualties a day coming back just to the north. He has already got that vision. Stuart Udall, who we interviewed, said that TR had distance in his eyes. And we showed a picture of Theodore Roosevelt next to a globe, as if that distance meant you could look around it. Well, nobody in our history has had more distance in his eyes than Abraham Lincoln. And to see that great thing and to sign that into law that set aside Yosemite is just, one of the many, many gifts that Abraham Lincoln returns to us daily.
I love the synchronicity also, Ken, of when Ken Salazar was a secretary, the first national monument that President Obama designated was Fort Monroe.
Yes.
Fort Monroe was the place where Benjamin Butler summoned Lincoln within the confines of this Union fort in the middle of Confederate territory to lay out his philosophy about conscription and really creating a safe haven for slaves to come inside the fort and become freed. And kind of that led to the Emancipation Proclamation writing. And
yeah, and thank you, Will, for citing Benjamin Butler, who's because of some people, some losers have written the history of this, but Butler gets the short shrift of it. He's really important in changing the status of people who are called contraband. That is to say, recently freed slaves in the Virginia Tidewater area and in New Orleans. they're just contraband, and they're put to work for the Union Army and other federal things. But he's beginning to understand. I think he helps nudge Lincoln along so that when he does get a victory at least a stalemate at Antietam in September of '62, he can issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which is a very shrewd, mostly foreign policy document that doesn't free a single enslaved person in territories he doesn't control. In territories he controls, he keeps them enslaved to keep Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware and other slave owners happy. But it does free everybody in places he doesn't control, and it stops France and particularly England from trying to break the Union blockade of the South, their mills desperate for Southern cotton. It's a hugely important moment, and it's Butler who helps move him into that place.
Yes, agreed. Well, we're getting kind of wonky here on our history, I realize, but let's get back to the, your series, which was released in 2009. You already touched on this, Ken, that the popularity of the parks since then has gone up significantly. But it was about 270, 275 about the time that you released the series per year. It's now more than 325 million visitors per year, which is remarkable. Unfortunately, during that time, federal funding for our parks has been fairly flat, and meaning fewer rangers to elevate visitor experience, less money to maintain and restore infrastructure, and limited resources to address changes like climate change and expand storytelling in the park. So your work frequently touches on the power of collective memory and the importance of preserving history. So I'm going to ask you, in what ways do you think those of us who love national parks, like those on our call today, can draw on the lessons from your documentaries to inspire broader public support for our national parks?
Well, this is really the only question, I think. Unfortunately, part of setting aside of land has become too politicized, and so it becomes part of our binary dialectic, and it shouldn't be. This is just a great story. Everybody on earth has copied us. We called it, following our subtitle, Following Wallace Stegner, was America's best idea. It's not. America's best idea is in the Declaration and the Constitution. But if you were looking for something after those two documents that would represent the best of us, it would be the national parks. And there's so much unfunded maintenance needed. Remember, the big complaint for a while was that they were being loved to death. There were too many people. That's okay in a short-term sense, in that it provides the parks with constituents. So then what I'd like to do is just reverse that and say, if there are no constituents, then there's nobody there to raise their hand in opposition when somebody wants to sell it or mine it or cut it down or alter it. Our job now, turning it around yet again, is to everyone within the sound of my voice who is a constituent of these national parks to be more active, to help remind people this is a shared inheritance. This is the crown jewels that are not in the Tower of London. They are our crown jewels, and they're, this is the greatest democratic idea that the most beautiful spots of land on our continent are owned not by monarchy, not by kings, not by queens, not by the very rich, but by everybody and for all time. And the only thing we're required to do is be as you would of anything that you own, is go and check it out and make sure it's being taken care of. And it's not. It just needs a little bit more love and attention. And of course, when we're talking at the federal, that means money. And we just need to be articulate, bipartisan advocates for why these are central to the health and progress and security of this republic.
Yeah. I think that's great. You mentioned Stuart Udall earlier. He was one of the champions for the establishment of the National Park Foundation. I don't know if you knew that, Ken, but in 1967, we were established. He was still Interior Secretary, and he joined forces with Lady Bird Johnson and Lawrence Rockefeller, who had been involved with the President's Commission on America's Outdoors that recommended the establishment of NPF, which is really the first of now many federal agencies that are supported by a nonprofit like ours. And we now have more than 450 park partners. Ken, I don't know if you knew that, but it's an incredible, you talk about the manifestation of our democracy through this. Is a manifestation of support for parks through nonprofit organizations and citizens who recognize that we're not necessarily going to have as much money from the federal government, but collectively we help lift up and support these great places. And
when you said thing I'm working on, the Leonardo's done. There are several other films actually actively, but the one that's coming out next is A History of the American Revolution.
Oh,
And,
wow.
you know, I have always argued that every single historical society, every single national park foundation or supporting group ought to be interested in this. This is
Mm,
our origin story. It's a lot more complicated than we've been led to believe, and it's an even better story than you can possibly imagine when the lens is widened out to tell and include so many stories in it. So I think, you know, as much as we accept the violence of the Civil War, say, we sort of treat our revolution as if it's a bug in amber, you know,
yeah.
encased in lucite, and we're not going to touch it. It's just about great men thinking great ideas, and it's very much about that. But it's also a bloody civil war itself, where our Civil War was not a civil war; it was a sectional war, and that complicates the story. But out of it is a national origin story, of which the national parks ought to be, as I've been trying to say over and over again, the crowning achievement.
Well, listen, it's, the America's 250 is coming up, at 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and obviously the American Revolutionary War was a big piece of that early history. And I think it's, our organization and the Park Service is more reflective way back when. To your point, like, there's been a lot of reflection on the Civil War, it seems like, but not as
Yes.
much to go back 250 years. So, any other thoughts or reminders about that time?
Yeah, well, the American Revolution started in April of 75. We're going to come out in November of 75, the year before. We hope to somewhere lead a more complicated discussion among the country, a big national broadcast. It's 6 episodes, 12 hours in length. It I hope will help us sort of recalibrate and rededicate ourselves to the principles of the founding. Our film goes from 20 years before the war began up to, you know, basically the Constitutional Convention and beyond, to the end of George Washington's term, but also right up to the present, just because the ideas are, as Benjamin Rush at the time said, the fighting is over, the war is over, but the American Revolution is still going on, and that we have to understand the ways in which we are in the process of becoming, pursuit of happiness, a more perfect union. All of this is an activity, and it relates to almost everything we do, every job we have, but certainly with regard to your mandate and mine, it's an ongoing, constant job. And so we would invite you into this, helping to tell the story and getting the word out to every Middlesex village and farm about what we're up to, and drive the viewership necessary to have a much more nuanced, a much more complicated, a much more fulfilling story of what happened in our founding, so that by the time we get around to July 4th, 2026, the 250th and beyond, that we're a smarter, thoughtful, more civil republic, able to tolerate the inevitable contradictions that attend anything in our lives.
Sounds to me like we need to have another conversation a year from now to talk about that one.
Absolutely. I'm there with bells on.
Good, good, excellent. So I'm going to go back to the series for a second and just remind everybody, and maybe you can share your own perspective on this, but we were all glued to our screens back in 15 years ago, right about exactly this time. And I do remember a pretty fun moment that you got to do a screening with President Obama in the White House, and I don't know, that was probably the first one of those you've done, Ken. And tell us a bit about that moment for you.
Well, I've been so lucky. We premiered our film on Lewis and Clark and Thomas Jefferson in Clinton's White House in the East Room, not far from where Meriwether Lewis lived as his secretary, and later came back and showed him, Mr. President, I'm sorry, Mr. Jefferson, there's no Northwest Passage as we thought. President Bush and his wife Laura hosted the first post 9/11 kind of thing about Mark Twain, a lunch and
Mhm.
stuff. But what was so unique in 2009 is that President Obama screened it just intimately in the small screening room, and we were able to, just show him, an hour's worth of clips from the film. And it was, one of the highlights of our life. And the photographs that the White House Center, of course, adorned Dayton's and my walls. And my kitchen has a picture of all of us posing, my entire family, of at that point just 3 girls and a son-in-law posing, for a picture with the president. It was a really spectacular moment. And of course, as you said before, in his designations of national monuments, not just Monroe, but also in the Marianas and other places of expanding maritime places, it's done more to, again, evolve the idea of the park idea. If it was static, it would be dead already. And it's not static, it's growing. And I think what you guys do is so critical to keeping it alive. And where, Dayton and I have always had our hats off to what you do and what you're continuing to do. And you should let us know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Help.
So Ken, I mean, this is, you kind of expect this question, but would you ever consider doing a sequel? I mean, I'm sure that when you finished the National Park series, you thought, well, we could have done 50 more things, but you've already acknowledged that you're full up till the end of the 20s, but
there are the 30s. Yeah. So it's funny, Will, you finish and you'd think that making a film is additive. It's actually subtractive. I live in New Hampshire and we make maple syrup, and it takes 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. And that is a pretty good understanding of what we do. We usually have about a 40-to-1, probably with national parks a little bit more, because of nature photography takes that much more time to do, and you're waiting for certain light conditions or animals to do things that animals aren't necessarily, they're not in the union, let's put it that way. And thank goodness. And they are, we've got amazing footage, but what's on the cutting room floor is never bad. It's always good stuff, but that good stuff doesn't reassemble. So I think that in some ways we keep making it over and over again. Leonardo is, even though it's an Italian narrative and an Italian landscape, and to a lesser extent French, it's still dealing with this power of nature. We invented a new catechism. We obviously our political system is the best that's ever been invented. And then we also had freedom of religion. So it allowed Americans to develop a kind of new catechism, particularly within the splintered Protestant denominations, that Emerson says essentially you can worship God more easily in cathedrals made by nature rather than in cathedrals made by man. And this translates to Thoreau and translates to John Muir. And we begin to understand a sense of us finding in nature a perfection, as Leonardo did, that we obviously don't have in our imperfect lives and relationships and dealings, politics, you could say. And that there in front of us is this extraordinary guide. So never say never. There's always a possibility we'll return to a particular place or whatever, but there's not a part 2 to this because it was so open-ended. And let's remember, like baseball that has parks as well, it's not always the thing that you're seeing. It's who you see it with.
Yeah.
Every description of a basketball game, Michael Jordan hit a 3-pointer, football, Joe Montana, but a baseball story begins, my mom or my dad took me, and I remember how green it was. A national park story, you may be standing in front of the grandest canyon on earth, but you know whose hand you're holding. And that's the importance, the human dimension, not just the human story of how it was formed, the Native American relationship to that land, what happened as European white American settlers came in and how they transformed it and who decided to set it and the drama of that. But right now, this is where Americans sort of regather their Americanness. It might be that iconic tour that people took when I was growing up around the Western, parks. It may be other ways, more haphazard now because of the internet, but nonetheless, we found that in times of difficulty, they're the place in our doorstep that permits us to restore. This is what John Muir understood. It's what Ralph Waldo Emerson understood, and it's our great legacy, and it's just our responsibility to protect it as best we can.
Thank you. Well, in our last 90 seconds or so here, Ken, I wanted to just connect a few dots, and I think that your series in 2009 was one piece. And I think that, you know, when we went inside for COVID, that was another piece where people really recognize the importance of being in the outside, in the outdoors, and connecting with the outdoors. And you just talked about some of the spiritual dimensions and the, you know, historical dimensions, but there's just the human dimension and a health dimension of connecting with the outdoors for its own sake. And the fact that these are, in fact, as you said, the physical manifestation of our democracy. These are places that belong to all of us. They're relatively inexpensive to go visit, except, you know, if you're going to Hawaii or the Marianas or the Alaska, it's a little more expensive. But in your, you know, final comment, you know, what are your thoughts on this part of the national parks idea?
It's just the central one, Will. I since the project came out in 2009, that's 15 years ago, I don't think there's been a day that I've been out in the public where somebody hasn't come and mentioned it, that we went there, or I went with my dad, he passed away. Now I'm taking my kids there, or my mom took us there on this. And my own story is connected to that. I thought when I hit Yosemite that I had not been to a national park besides battlefields, but a big, you know, national park. And then I remember that my dad, just before my mom died, had taken me on a weekend trip down the Skyline Drive in Shenandoah National Park, relatively small if you compare it to the majesty of Yosemite or Glacier or Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon. But for me, you know, I reclaimed something that I had been lost, this special connection with my dad at a time of great difficulty for our family. And we all have something like that. And we know the way, particularly COVID reminded us that there was a difference between loneliness and solitude, and nature can be that intervener between the difference. That to be lonely is a sad condition. To be in solitude actually fills the spirit. And this is our American story. We've got this continent. Its story is complicated, how we got it. It's not without losers. But we did do a really good thing, which was set aside a good portion of it, and the most beautiful portion of it, for everybody and for all time. And that means not just my children and my grandchildren, but my grandchildren's grandchildren. And that this is just a priceless legacy. And we return a little bit to the Native American viewpoint, that you had to see 7 generations out, that you made decisions, not judge me quarter to quarter. How are we doing? How's the dividend playing? But what is our birthright? How do we understand not ownership of land, but stewardship of land? And I think that's at the heart of what the national park idea continually reminds us, to rethink our relationship with the land and this priceless treasure that we've inherited.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ken, for joining us, and so many connections between our mission and yours. And I think your work reminds us of the beauty and inspiring stories that shape our national identity. And you consistently reiterate that we all have what we have in common, rather than emphasizing the differences that we might have. So
it's just us. That's what the US is a U and an S. It's
exactly.
us. There's no them.
And thank you for reminding us that again and again. And we greatly look forward to seeing Leonardo and having you back on a year now. We've already made that date.
Yeah, we've got it. It's down.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Really appreciate it. And for all of you online, we're so grateful that you could join us today. And each of you is responsible for the stewardship of our national parks. And so a heartfelt thank you to all. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's program, so stay connected. Please email us at events@nationalparks.org. Our national parks do so much for all of us, and each of you is a part in preserving and protecting these incredible places. And we hope you all will continue to tune in with us. We look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks so much.